You're live, Madam Chair.
Hey, welcome back, folks. This is House Corrections and Institutions. It's Thursday, April 13th. And we have moved on to another section of Department of Corrections, which is the Department of Corrections Victim Services. And, we haven't really done much of a deep dive in this. It kind of has been on the periphery of some of our conversations. So we have Meredith Pelkey, who's the Director of the Victim Services for the Department. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you.
And if you could identify yourself for the record, and then it's all yours. Give us a review of what the Victim Services Department is and what it does, and then I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions.
Great. So my name is Meredith Pelkey, and I'm the Victim Services Director for the Department of Corrections. And I've been with Corrections for about 6 months, so I'm still pretty
You're
new.
a newbie.
Yes, I'm pretty new with Corrections. Before that, I worked for the Department for Children and Families as a social worker, and before that, I worked at a CJC for many years, doing the reparative panels. So I'm familiar with a lot of the justice system. So what the Victim Services Unit does is really serve as a bridge in the gap of needs of individuals who've been impacted by crime, specifically individuals who are under the custody of the Department of Corrections. So what that means is that we support victims in whatever they need throughout the post-adjudication process. So when somebody's in or being supervised in the field, we really support victims in whatever they need. We also have some statutory obligations that we need to make sure we follow, and those are notifying people of hearings, specifically parole hearings, making sure that they are able to participate in those hearings, and also that the victim's voice is at the table throughout the incarceration process, and when they're being supervised in the field. So that means we sit on a lot of different teams. We're a very small unit, so there's only 5 of us, including myself. And the victim services specialists are a really great group of women that I work with who are very passionate about their work. And they have a lot of cases. Most have around 80 to 90 cases that they are assigned. And there's certain criteria that needs to be met for us to be assigned. I mean, and that's not set in stone. If there's victims who have a lot of issues or a lot of needs, we will take on those cases as well, but we couldn't take on every case. So we rely a lot on the casework staff, probation officers to really do that victim work as well. So another thing that we do in our unit is we offer trainings and support and coaching to the probation officers and the casework staff when dealing with victims.
So are we talking, when we're talking victims, are we talking incarcerated or previously incarcerated people that are victims? Or are we talking victims of a crime that maybe the perpetrator is incarcerated?
We're talking about victims of crime who now the person that committed the crime is incarcerated,
Okay.
or being supervised.
So there are victims that are living in the community, victims
Yes.
that are not involved with the judicial system other than that.
Usually not, right?
Good. I've heard these folks referred to as survivors. I'm sure your language is very intentional. I'm wondering if you had sort of worked.
So we've talked a lot about victims and survivors in our work, and a lot of the victims are not necessarily survivors in the work that we do. So a lot of the victims are family members of people who've been murdered. So that language was intentional in that we work with families of people who passed on, and we still are talking about that,
You're
but
not the subject of the crime.
exactly.
They survived the impact of the crime.
Yes,
So I would expand it that way, but you factor that in?
yes, yes. We've talked about that a lot. And I'm sure we'll continue to talk about how we refer to.
And I need to step out for a minute.
Okay, thank you.
So keep going.
Yes.
You got interrupted.
Yes, so it can be complicated, our work in the Department of Corrections, as you can imagine, because we are representing and supporting the people who have been impacted by the people who are incarcerated. So it creates a bit of a rub sometimes with the work that's going on in the facility, and also making sure that DOC staff is reminded that there are victims of crime and that these crimes create a ripple effect throughout the whole community. And I'm sure you all have seen that in your communities too, because when a crime is committed, it's not just against a person, it's against a community. It can create lots of impact with safety of the community, how people feel in their community. So, you know, it's a difficult job, I think. And the people that do this job are very passionate. And we don't just work with the victims ourselves, we also make a lot of community connections so that they can support victims as well. Because we're a very small staff. So a lot of the work we do is connecting victims with services as well in the community. So we are always working on building our relationships with those folks. We have lots of joint meetings with different advocates around the state. We also are part of many multidisciplinary teams within each community. So that is comprised of law enforcement, state's attorneys. We also work closely with the CJCs on a lot of issues. When we talk about COSAs, I'm sure you've heard about COSAs, because there's victims involved in all of these aspects of corrections and the justice system in general.
So if you have would you get involved in a situation where someone, it's domestic violence or something similar, and the person who has been incarcerated is coming up to their release date, their minimum to go on furlough, to go on parole, for some people parole, and the victim is a family member, and do you work with the person to really help navigate this eventual release?
Yes.
And also sometimes the person who's incarcerated can say, oh yeah, I've got a place where I can go. I can live, I can go back to where I was, or I can go and the person who was victimized, maybe a family member, and say, no, I don't want this person back, but I don't feel safe to let the person know I don't want them back. Does the Victim Services Department get involved?
Yes, that's
in
a
a situation like that.
That's a lot of the work we do, and I appreciate you asking that. So as soon as there's a release date, and if a victim service specialist is assigned, we start working with the staff on the release. We work with the victim closely to figure out, where they're living, where they're working, and if there's still safety issues, we sometimes, the victim will say, I can't have them in the community with me. And we'll look at that and we will advocate for them not to be released into, that part of the community where the victim is residing. So that can be difficult because a lot of our folks don't necessarily have a lot of places to go when they're released.
So in a situation like that, but particularly more of a situation that the incarcerated person saying, yeah, I can go live in this house with this person, and this person is the victim, and this person doesn't want them there, but this person doesn't want to let the incarcerated person know that I don't want you there. Does your position in your department, let the incarcerated person know that, no, this person doesn't want you there, or do you work at it at a different angle?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be very careful about that because we can put people in harm's way. So we do, especially with the parole board, victims have the opportunity to talk to the parole board alone. And so we will arrange for that to happen. So yeah, we do a lot of safety planning with victims, and especially domestic violence victims.
Mhm.
That's very delicate.
Yeah.
So I was kind of wondering, remember the previous presenter, remember the pie chart with the males versus the females? And I was wondering what the cause of that was. We also heard other testimony where it talks about, communication with people on the outside. And I'm wondering whether or not some of the people back home are being talked into, agreeing to let them go back and stay there when in fact nothing's better, that they're going to be right back in the situation. So the question is, how often do you see repeat offenses occurring subsequent to someone going back to, where everybody agreed that it was all right for them to go?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's difficult. That does happen at times. And, we have to really, I mean, we work closely with the victims, talking to them about their safety. And ultimately, if they want contact and this is what they want, we have to honor that. But, the court in the probation order can prohibit that, and they often do. Or there can be conditions in the parole. So it's a delicate place to be, but that does happen. And we try to support the victim with where they are. And hopefully, create safety while we're doing that.
Do you ever work with the victims to enable the opportunity for them to communicate directly with the person who committed the crime and do some sort of like a post-release mediation or something like that?
We do something called victim offender dialogue. We have a pretty robust program where if a victim asks to have contact with the incarcerated individual or the person who perpetrated the crime, we will, it's a long process, it's very deliberate, but we will work with them to make that happen. And all of the people in our unit are trained in doing victim offender dialogue.
Can the person who's incarcerated request that, or it has to come from the victim side?
It usually has to come from the victim, yeah. And sometimes the incarcerated individual does not want to do that. And we, it's a delicate balance. We have to determine, if the victim is really going to, if the victim understands that their need might not necessarily get met. But we have had some very successful victim offender dialogues that it can be very deep and meaningful for the victim and the perpetrator. Yeah.
So I know when we instigated the earned time, good time, earned time, there were some issues. Thought that we had enough communication with the victim services. I think it was I don't think it was the department within DOC. I think it was a different organization for victim services. But there was real concern that the victims were not taken into account, which we in the committee thought that we had put in the language specifically for victims to be notified, and the way it got rolled out was not done in the best manner. What are you seeing from your position in the department's victim services in terms of how earned time is being put in place and how now it's starting to really play out? How is that working on your victim services? Is there concern from the victims that we have earned time
Yes.
Or is it settling down?
Well, I do think it's settling down because I think we're all aware that this can happen. And so the victims advocates at the state's attorney's office, we call them the SAVAs, they have a good understanding now of earn time, and they have been explaining that to victims. So we're seeing less of that, but once in a while, we'll still have a victim who's very surprised at an early release. So we really will work with them around what that looks like and try to give them as much notice as we can.
So when they're surprised that the person is going to release earlier than the minimum because they've earned that time off their sentence, are the victims notified that at the front end, at the beginning of the sentence? Or is it more as the person gets closer to that release date that they're notified? Or are they also notified during the time of incarceration that the person has earned this many days off their sentence each month?
Well, if the victim services unit is involved, we keep them up to date on as well as we can with changes in release dates. So we are able to run reports when release dates change, and we really try to keep the victims up to date on releases.
Because for the committee, for folks who are incarcerated, they can get 7 days per month for 30 days off their sentence. And we put that in place 3 years ago, I think it was. Some crimes may not be eligible for that. If you're convicted of some crimes, you may be eligible. But the majority of the times, I don't know if it's a big 12 listing or there's a few crimes that if you're convicted of that, you would not be eligible for that.
It has been hard for them, as you can imagine. That's sort of hard for some of them to swallow when, they've lost a loved one or been very hurt. To know that, the incarcerated individual is earning good time. Yeah.
And then we also put with the presumptive parole piece, we also, and you mentioned this, the victims could address the parole board. Are you finding that when someone is up for presumptive parole, that the victims are coming forward to address the parole board?
Yes, that's definitely happening. And we are working closely with the parole board to make sure that victims have been notified as well, even on cases we're not assigned to.
We heard testimony recently, and now I'm not remember where it came from, but the impact of those from the parole board, the impact that doing those virtually has had on seemingly an increase in the victims. And I remember the graph that I think there were 20 some victims that recently showed up, all with an advisor. So it seems to me, I don't have a question here. Maybe I do have a question. Has that improved from your perspective since doing virtual programming?
Yes, it actually has. I think victims feel much safer.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely has improved.
And I noticed that each of the 20 victims who had participated had a support person with them. So
Great. Yeah.
clearly, you all are a vital part of this.
Yeah. Thank you.
So do you have any recommendations on what we could do better?
Well, again, our unit is small, but when victim services began, we used to have a victim services specialist in every office, and now it's really small. Our unit is really small, so we can only take on a certain amount of cases, and usually they're the cases that are, the ones you hear about.
Yeah, more high profile.
Yes. So, I think we're just working really hard to make sure that our staff are trained and trauma informed, and are learning how to work with victims. But as you can imagine, that's tough when there's a small unit.
Eric, Michelle, and Chip.
I want to first start by expressing my gratitude and appreciation to yourself as well as your team in the Department of Corrections.
Thank
It's
you.
notoriously known throughout all correctional systems that always the least funded and the least staffed are the victim services. Yet they are the foundation and the most important piece to all of this. It is concerning to me to hear that we are not able to reach out and provide services to victims because you're doing the best you can. That to me is concerning. We gotta do something. We gotta support the victims of these crimes. And we gotta get the services and the people staffed for this agency. It shouldn't even be a question. I mean, all of us are sitting here and we have heard hours and hours of testimony from the other side. And victim services agencies, 45 minutes. What do you need?
Yeah, we need the staff. We really need the staff. We need the funding, and we need to be able to support the victims of these crimes that are happening in our communities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle?
Yeah, so I had a question. So when Alice first asked, what is something that we could do, it kind of raised a question for me in terms of, I remember recently within the last week or so, we had somebody came in and did a presentation about what different people are incarcerated for. And there was a fairly big segment that were in for vehicular charges, which were felonies. So I'm assuming a lot of those are probably DUIs that resulted in injury or death. And I'm wondering if somebody goes in and they serve their time, for killing someone in a DUI, on the treatment end, while people are incarcerated, from what I gather, we don't have a lot right now. I mean, you must be talking to people who are about to be, the person who killed their child in a drunk driving accident is about to be released. Do you feel like DOC is providing enough treatment in terms of recovery to help those people safely reenter and not fall back into patterns of causing problems because of substance use or not? I mean, is that an area that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is a challenging area for a lot of corrections around the United States. I'm really dealing with substance use and treatment while people are incarcerated.
Because it feels like there's such different types of crimes that are possible.
Yes.
And if somebody's released and they killed someone in a DUI and they haven't had any treatment, it doesn't feel like we're doing the right thing for the victims or for the offender in terms of making the community safe for that reentry.
Yeah, I agree.
Chip and then Wayne?
That's where the ISAC program used to be, a furlough program that would treat fairly long-term on that type of situation. Because on furlough, it would count as incarcerated time. It doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't happen anymore.
It's an intensive program.
But when I worked for public defender's office, when our clients would be taken out of the home and incarcerated, I was the one that would get all the calls from the victims saying, I can't pay my rent, I can't pay my fuel bill, and all these services that are just removed immediately from the household presents a real problem for the victims. And, I would refer them to state's attorneys, victims advocates, and but apparently there's no funding to intervene on that. Is what I'm hearing. I mean, you could use more funding, but I mean, certainly that's a service that would really be a great benefit to victims of crimes where the money earner was removed from the household, and all of a sudden you can't pay your bills.
Yeah, I mean, we really help connect people with economic services, all the supports in the community. We're very familiar, so we do a lot of work with that too. Yeah, housing. Yeah.
Okay.
With a limited staff like that, though, someone's in prison for a DUI, somebody died. Generally speaking, the person didn't intend to kill anybody. On the other hand, we got people in there to rape or other things, murder or whatever, that are going back into society and perhaps back to the same household. It would seem to me that given the shortness of staff, there has to be some triage in terms of which one is more likely to immediately cause some serious harm out in the community. Have that kind of thinking going on?
Yes, we always are thinking about that and triaging and connecting people with services that we can't necessarily provide because of our small unit, but absolutely.
Well, also the triage is happening within the Department of Corrections for the person who's incarcerated.
Yes.
They may be eligible for furlough at the minimum, doesn't mean they're gonna get it.
Right.
They may be eligible for parole, doesn't mean they're gonna get it.
Yeah.
That's why there's the reviews at those times. Just because someone is eligible doesn't mean they're gonna be released.
Right.
John?
The 5 positions are the most you're allowed.
Yes, right now that's what we
Okay,
have.
so you don't
to
have any
say.
open positions.
Not
then.
right now.
How's your turnover rate?
Oh, we've had people who have been in this unit for 19 years. So, you know, the women that work in this unit, we just have women right now. They are so committed and passionate about this work.
So to help folks understand the budgeting process. So they can make a request for more staff that then goes up to the commissioner. Depends on how many openings are in the vacancy pool or what the number of state employees are for that particular department. And then the commissioner, when the departments are submitting their budgets to the 5th floor in September, would submit some possible position for this. And then the 5th floor makes the decision in terms of whether to propose funding in those positions or not to the General Assembly, and that's something the appropriations committee. So that would be the process. And what's happened over the last 10 years has been concerned with state employees. There were too many numbers of state employees, so every department and agency got squeezed. And that's been going on for about 10 years. So we start seeing the ramifications of that over time.
Yeah.
But just to lay out the process, that's how it works in state government. In terms of how positions are funded, depends on the vacancy pool. And that depends on the number of positions that are allowed for a particular department or agency. And some departments over time have been really getting squeezed, like the Agency of Education is really getting squeezed. And now we're starting to see that. Yeah. So just to lay out the groundwork for folks here. There are not a lot of new members to the General Assembly and trying to figure out what all those processes are.
Yeah. Well, it's very important work, I think, to communities and to everyone who's been a victim of crime. This is essential work and support that is needed. And I appreciate you all for asking very thoughtful questions about this.
Thank you. I don't know what I missed, but so I have a question that you can feel. Just feel free to pass on this, of course, or just say that I missed it. But we're working on building a new women's correctional facility. I heard. And you know, I think a facility like that can accommodate. We really start with fresh thinking about it, can accommodate all kinds of needs. And just from your point of view, your job, thinking about victim services, thinking about that facility that you would like to see happen.
Yeah, I've been working a little bit with Kathleen Fox on talking about, we have a letter bank, and really talking about how to bring some restorative, interventions into different facilities where we talk about how harm impacts people and how we repair harm when harm happens, and really talking about, possibly creating an avenue where students could help individuals write letters So that can be very powerful for victims. And we also keep these letters in a bank. So a victim may not want a letter right away, but may decide down the road they do want a letter. So really talking about doing that kind of restorative work in the facilities. I think that's really an important part.
Other folks? Thank you. Thank you. for coming
Thank
in.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
so much.
Appreciate it. So we have a few more minutes before our next scheduled folks. If you want to take a quick 5-minute break, take it now, because then we'll be here until probably noon, because we have 10:30 to 11:30, and then Dan's coming in at 11:30.